For the third time in less than a decade, the United States is being called to declare yay or nay on Donald Trump. The strange nationwide fascination with this straw man strongman has reached its final and most crucial hour. The vice president has delivered the final speech of her campaign at the site where Mr. Trump once incited a violent mob to overthrow the results of the 2020 election. There is little I could say that could surpass her straight and to the point message, and that is for the best. I would hate for the superior case to be made in a venue where very few people would hear it. What I can offer is some of my own observations. When I was around 12 years old, I was living in Mississippi and still adjusting to the culture shock of moving to a small town after knowing only big city life. One day we were watching the local news and a report came on about a controversy at Walmart which was selling a t-shirt featuring the character Margaret Wade from the Dennis the Menace comics. The character was shown smiling with hands spread wide under the words, "Someday a woman will be president." The shirt was being pulled nationwide after shoppers found the message offensive. Walmart's reasoning was that the message went against family values. I was lost as to what made the message so unacceptable. My dad explained it simply. Some people think that women should only ever be barefoot, pregnant, and tied to the bed. It was perhaps my first introduction to the reality that the people who stress the concept of family values are not those that are committed to fostering a warm, stable, loving family unit above all else. Instead, they are those that have convinced themselves and others that having a family gives them some sort of license to lord their restrictive values over others. I was reminded of that sentiment when J.D. Vance argued that Kamala Harris could not be trusted with the presidency because she did not have children of her own and thus no skin in the game. And that is the naked truth of a deeply un-American mindset, the notion that there are some Americans who are more American than the unwashed heathens they tolerate sharing the country with. That arrogant, haughty, aristocratic attitude is a bedrock of the toxic conservatism that Mr. Trump and Mr. Vance cater to, and strangely, it is what salt-of-the-earth Republican voters seem drawn to despite having no personal connection to it. This manipulation of the common man into believing that he has some personal connection to the wealthy elites goes back to the civil rights era. See, the reason we have a white underclass known as white trash in this country is because in the days of slavery, the Crown was sending over debt prisoners to work off their dues with indentured servitude. To be clear, I am in no way attempting to as some do, deny that the U.S. slave trade was a racist institution. It very much was. But it is a reality that white prisoners were sent over to the U.S. colonies to do manual labor jobs during this time period. Many such persons were unable to return home or chose to remain in the U.S. when their indentures were over. The result was an economic substratum of white people who went into sharecropping and other similar fields. While they definitely fared better than their black counterparts, they were saddled with the upper class disdain of being hicks, hillbillies, rednecks, bumpkins, and all other terms used to cut down what was, for all intents and purposes, the white American serf class. As the Industrial Revolution took over, so did unionized labor. The wealthy elites, many of them recent descendants of slave owners, did not want to have to meet the black man at the negotiation table. They knew that the best way to kneecap unions was to stoke racial division in their ranks. Consequently, the wealthy elites of the southern United States began reaching out with favors like sponsorships for low-income white children to attend elite private schools, as well as the all-too-familiar anti-black propaganda that flourished throughout the civil rights era. On a side note, if you're wondering how I came to be aware of all of this, one of my favorite Southern novels, The Oxygen Man by Steve Yarbrough, explores the phenomenon and the resulting class relationships as one of its core themes. Thus, the fallacious notion that the wealthy elites had some sort of personal commonality with their impoverished counterparts was born. And yes, I'm well aware that there was a time in this country when such people would have called themselves Democrats, not Republicans. That's because there was a point in U.S. history where the two parties effectively switched seats at the table, but that's a story for another time. Suffice to say, the Donald Trumps of the world have always taken advantage of the underclass by pretending they have some sort of kinship. That attitude persists today. Others have pointed out, as I myself cannot stomach reading it, that J.D. Vance's memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, positions him as having the sort of rural background that would endear him to blue-collar voters, but throughout the narrative it becomes clear that he actually has a seething disdain for such people. Fortunately, J.D. Vance is a metrosexual cyborg with no ability to connect on a human level, so it's fairly easy to see through him. So when Trump and the Christian nationalists that worship him extol the virtues of family values, they aren't promoting the kind of warm, loving family units celebrated in Adventures in Odyssey. They're trying to convince you that buying into their worldview will make you a better sort of American, the sort of American they will protect from the slime and the filth. Make no mistake about that offer. To stoke division and scatter the people who could rise up and oppose them has always been their only goal. Throughout my support for Kamala Harris, I've received comments and vitriol from one person after another who mocks the notion that I would think that Kamala is sincere in posturing as someone who genuinely cares about the needs of the people she represents. It's amazing to me that people can look to Donald Trump, a wholly incompetent charlatan and white-collar crook who masqueraded as a savvy cutthroat real estate tycoon that was never taken seriously in the business world but fooled the public during his stint as a game show host, and think that he is the one that is sincerely on the side of the American people, while Kamala Harris, a lifelong civil servant, first as district attorney and then as a politician, is some sort of Machiavellian figure. But that attitude persists because Trump, even ever the con man, has sided with the people who have been running this con on the American people for decades. There's an old saying that if you're looking around the room and can't tell who the sucker is, then it's you. And that could not be a better descriptor for the atmosphere into which Donald Trump has placed the American voter. But the notion of sincerity is ultimately irrelevant in light of the methodology by which they propose to handle the presidency. Kamala has promised to govern by way of a balanced respect and consideration for all sides, while Mr. Trump has proposed a steroid-fed version of the belligerent stomping around that characterized his first term in office. Wherever you stand on the issues, Kamala's approach will serve you better in the long run. Consider this. Throughout the campaign, Mr. Trump has leaned heavily on opposition to transgenderism. I find it ironic that the very conservatives who call Kamala Harris a purveyor of nonsensical word salads would stand behind the man who, in a desperate attempt to save face at a presidential debate, blithered some bizarre nonsense about children being surgically transitioned during the school day only to be sent home to horrified parents. Of all the vitriol and rhetoric around this topic, there is not one staunch anti-trans activist who has claimed that was happening. Certainly, there are more subtle issues at hand, such as the ethics surrounding the practice of teachers helping to socially transition students at school without the knowledge or consent of the parents. Such issues need to be approached at the political level with compassion, patience, empathy, and a willingness to listen to and weigh the merits of a wide array of arguments, as well as appreciate dissenting voices who present in good faith. These are not things that Donald Trump is capable of doing. In the words of Winston Churchill, his is the only case I have ever known of a bull who carried his own china shop with him. As paradoxical as it may seem, if you are anti-trans, you need to vote for Kamala Harris. Think about it this way. In light of the Cass report, the alleged scientific, medical, and psychiatric consensus under which gender transition procedures developed has been under harsh scrutiny to such a degree that the United States and Canada are the only countries in the developed world that have not closed gender clinics and begun to revise policies related to the topic. Bill Maher even openly wondered why this would be in one of his new rules segments. The answer is fairly simple. Opposition to transgenderism in the United States has been a largely right-wing phenomenon, and we are a deeply divided country. Do you think that AOC will ever admit that Marjorie Taylor Greene was right about something? Of course not. Coming to terms on this issue will require bipartisan support in an atmosphere of mutual respect and an understanding that both sides share a mutual concern for the well-being of those affected by the issue in all capacities. That kind of atmosphere is what Kamala Harris is promising, and that atmosphere will have to exist and be a comfortable foundation of U.S. politics before the trans issue can be properly addressed in a manner that respects and accommodates the reasonable concerns of both sides while disavowing the wild hysterics at the outer edges of both sides. It will be a slow and gradual process that carefully evaluates which facets of the issue are matters of public policy and which facets are private matters. Ironically, this is what the word conservative is supposed to imply, not the kind of stomping around and flipping over of tables guaranteed by Mr. Trump. But such practical considerations don't seem to be of interest to Trump supporters. There seems to be some sort of small test that they apply to the smell test that they apply to the candidates that tells them on some visceral level that Donald Trump is a strong, proud, admirable choice, while Kamala Harris is blatantly the choice of weak, servile losers. I don't comprehend the logic here. Donald Trump is a whiny, self-entitled brat with a massive inferiority complex who pathologically declares every one of his losses to be victory to such a degree that his entire career is one prolonged declaration of "'tis but a flesh wound." He is incapable of taking responsibility for his own ineptitude to such a degree that when he got stomped on in his one debate with Kamala, he blamed it on having his arguments unfairly challenged by the debate moderators who fact-checked him. And his followers eat that right up. Oh, poor baby. That wasn't very nice of them. They should have been more considerate of little Donald's feelings. Let's give him the presidency to make him feel better. Somehow, people want to believe that negotiations with world leaders should be put in the hands of a pompous sissy who can't handle two hostile debate moderators. As I've established, however, that self-delusion on the part of conservative voters isn't unique to Trump. It's baked into the GOP pie of which he has delivered a particularly tasty flavor. Trump voters could be forgiven for supporting the man during his 2016 presidential run. He had successfully hornswoggled the public during his time on The Apprentice to such a degree that even I began reading The Art of the Deal during the 2016 campaign until his ghostwriter emerged to declare that the whole thing was an elaborate fiction he concocted to sell the public on someone that he knew to be an incompetent sociopath the whole time he was writing it. Even so, public perception of Donald Trump as a real estate mastermind was so cemented in the public consciousness that his alleged skill as at deal making was touted as being one of his main selling points during his campaign. But his first term made all too clear what Kamala drilled home during the debate, that Donald's supposed deal-making skills were just people stronger and more competent than himself playing him for a fool by stroking his ego. The looking around the room and trying to find the sucker metaphor applies as much to Trump as the people he dupes. With this in mind, I tracked down the first episode of The Apprentice and watched it for the first time since it initially aired. I hadn't been a huge fan of the show, but I had watched the first season fairly regularly, mainly hoping to see Omarosa get fired. I remembered that the first episode had the contestants running competing lemonade stands, but that was about it. On seeing the episode a second time all these years later and knowing what I know now, I was struck by how little Mr. Trump actually says during the episode. Most of the actual business acumen is articulated by his assistants, while Mr. Trump is limited to short snippets that are obviously cut from larger statements. Tellingly, a comment about his belief in genetic superiority slips through, but the substance of what he's referring to is edited out. Seen in retrospect, it is obvious how fictionalized The Apprentice really was, but the point was really hammered home when John D. Miller, an NBC exec who worked on The Apprentice, emerged recently to apologize for helping to create the monster that is Donald Trump. As Miller explained, the creators of The Apprentice knew from the outset that Trump was a joke and a fraud. In fact, that was one of the reasons they wanted to work with him. Legitimate corporate CEOs were too busy to participate and not interested in hiring reality TV game show contestants to oversee their business interests. But Trump, a layabout playboy who masqueraded as a real estate magnate, had all the time in the world and, unlike actual businessmen, was deeply invested in cultivating a larger-than-life public image. Even the ominous boardroom where firings were carried out on the show was a television set. Trump's real boardroom was too old and too shabby. Suffice to say, there's nothing commendable about Donald Trump. Every single accomplishment that has been touted to the public has been a lie. Yet his supporters continue to lap up anything that gives him a semblance of legitimacy. I saw a tweet during the current election cycle from someone in the MAGA faithful that said, we quote, "We should all be so fortunate as to have a father that imparts such good values," close quote. The message was accompanied by an old video of Trump hamming it up for the camera in his office by telling a toddler-aged Barron that when he grew up, he was never to smoke, drink, and do drugs. Most people who have fathers at all are fortunate enough to hear that. Now, I know what you're wanting to say. You're going to tell me that Kamala was only successful because of her affair with Willie Brown. Well, the truth is more complicated, and that's probably why you don't want to hear it. While it is true that she and Brown did date between 1994 and 1995 while he was married, Brown and his wife had been separated for 13 years at that point. In other words, there was no expectation of monogamy by then, and this was not the kind of affair that destroys a healthy and prosperous marriage. Yes, Brown did give Kamala 2 political appointments during their relationship, but her first successful campaign for public office didn't happen until 8 years after the relationship ended. The insinuation that Kamala slept her way to the top is a lie. Snopes already knocked that slow pitch out of the park a long time ago, and even if the relationship was extramarital, it's hardly something that MAGA supporters can hold against her when their own candidate has cheated on every single one of his wives. I'll take your moral outrage seriously when you stop holding Donald Trump to a different standard than everybody else. How about the attempt to invalidate Kamala's claim to have experienced busing as a child by pointing out that at age 12 she moved to Canada? Well, that would mean that she had been in the U.S. school system for 7 years, during which time she could have experienced busing. And no, I don't need to hear endless posts about how Willie Brown's wife is a voodoo priestess or that Kamala supported medical weed but prosecuted distributors. You're tilting at windmills. At the end of the day, this sort of thing boils down to exactly what Michelle Obama pointed out in her speech, that for some reason the public is demanding perfection from Kamala while giving Donald Trump every single excuse in the world. You know full well that if Kamala had stopped a Q&A event to stand on stage and dreamily sway back and forth to a playlist of random songs while everyone else on stage looked around in obvious discomfort, the whole of the media and certainly MAGA itself would be all over that with rabid abandon. But when Donald Trump does it, all his faithful doesn't even see the need to acknowledge it as odd or ill-advised. I think that double standard reflects just how deeply ingrained the default assumption that Trump is superior on some intuitive level really is, but there is nothing there. He doesn't even have a winning personality. Ronald Reagan, for all his faults, knew how to exude a warm, grandfatherly charm. George W. Bush bungled 9/11 and its aftermath, but always knew how to be the guy who you wanted to hang out and have a beer with, and he probably was fun to be around at that level. But Trump doesn't even have that. He's a pompous, wheezing, eternally self-aggrandizing gasbag with no endearing qualities. But all of that is old hat at this point. The best his supporters can do is try to make Kamala out to be equally as bad or worse. They have nothing that actually exalts Trump. Saying that Kamala Harris is on the same level as Donald Trump is like trying to equate Barbara Streisand with William Hung. Anyone that's actually in touch with reality knows how absurd it is. So that's enough attention for now paid to Donald Trump and the delusional narcissism that sustains him. Let's talk about why I love Kamala Harris. I admit that I didn't give her much thought as a candidate in the 2020 election, nor did I really care when she became Biden's running mate. I was motivated by my hatred of Donald Trump and would have voted for whoever seemed best positioned to beat him. It wouldn't be a permanent solution. Trump would inevitably run again in 2024, but we would at least get a respite from our torments. Going into 2024, I knew Biden was a lame duck and that there wasn't much going for him other than not Trump. That was still enough for me, but I knew that it wouldn't connect with voters, especially given Biden's increasingly obvious mental decline. Things needed to shift, and quickly. James Carville was 100% right to point out that if Biden stepped down as the Democratic candidate, then the right's number one weapon against him, age, would become their number one problem in Mr. Trump. So when Joe Biden stepped aside and Kamala took over, I cannot begin to tell you the angelic sense of renewal that washed over me. The purifying fire of hope was restored in my soul. Just seeing a strong, confident person with light in their eyes stand where a vaguely animate corpse had been only moments ago was an elixir of joy more potent than I could have ever fathomed. Trump's supporters, I hesitate to call them the right as a whole because so many lifelong Republicans have been defecting to Kamala, started trying to find anything to assail her with. Bizarre to me was the claim that she spoke in incoherent word salads, yet I could find no evidence of that. I have no difficulty understanding what is meant by the phrase, what can be unburdened by what has been. She's inviting us to envision a potential future set free from the shortcomings of the past. How is that not obvious? Don't answer, I don't need to hear it. Wild distortions of her political career, like the aforementioned business with Willie Brown, began to emerge. Again, none of it rises to the level of Donald Trump. Oh, she campaigned as being tough on crime while accepting plea bargains from people you think she should have put away. Wow. That's right up there with sending a mob to the Capitol to delay the certification of the vote. And that was sarcasm. I hate that I have to point that out, but this is the internet. But despite the initial surge of popularity, Kamala still had much to prove, and she secured my faith in her ability to beat Trump when she faced him at the debate. She was his worst nightmare going into it, a strong, confident career woman who wasn't in the least bit impressed in the slightest by the glowing, grinning, preening, sneering, faux alpha male persona straw man that Donald Trump had been waving in the faces of the world for decades. As I listened to her debate, I could tell the difference between her and Hillary Clinton. Make no mistake, Hillary wanted Donald Trump as the final boss on her personal road to the White House, and it cost her and all the rest of us in the end. She was the wrong person to take on Trump. Ironically, she was the wrong person for the same reason Kamala is right. They're both women. In the 2010s, the rainbow-haired malcontents that had sunk thousands of dollars into getting bogus studies degrees were ruling the roost, so much so that Beyoncé blasting the word feminist behind her on a screen at the Super Bowl was considered some sort of profound statement, and Lena Dunham was being trotted out as Hollywood's new pear-shaped standard of female beauty. The corrosive attitudes of the cultural studies advocates were eating away at entertainment media, and there was this growing attitude that it was simply time for men to step aside. The penises had ruled the world for thousands of years, and the vaginas would put things right. Don't get me wrong, as annoying as all of that is, I still would have preferred it over Trump. It's the difference between having the flu and having an aggressive malignant brain tumor that sounds like a grown-up Eric Cartman. But people were put off by Hillary's campaigning as the first woman president, even as Donald Trump's boorish attitude was suffocating and stultifying. To understand why, I have to think about something that came to me when Obama first ran for president. It seems hilarious now, but at the time there were actually news outlets interviewing common folk who would say things like, "We just aren't ready for a black president." I don't know what they meant by that. I tend to think that they were just people who felt squirrely about having a black president and didn't want to admit it. But I thought about what it might mean in a productive sense to be ready for a step forward like the first black president, and this is what I've come to. We are ready for such an occurrence when, as a society, we are not banking on it. The election of Barack Obama as the first black president was undeniably a momentous occasion in U.S. history, but he didn't run his campaign on it. He was firm and steady in his campaign that there was not a black America or a white America, but just America. He genuinely gave off the vibe that he was here for all of us, and I think that he was. Hillary, on the other hand, gave off a vibe of entitlement. There was a feeling that she was snapping her fingers and demanding the vote, not earning it. It was that undeniable feeling of, you have voted for the black penis and shall now vote for the vagina as a display of your continued virtue. You just don't win votes by acting like you're entitled to them. As much as I despise Donald Trump, I voted for Gary Johnson thinking that I was being cool and above it all. In retrospect, I really shouldn't have convinced myself that victory was possible for a candidate that drove himself to his campaign rallies. So while Hillary would have been an undeniably better president than Trump, she shot herself in the foot by playing into the very PC social justice crowd that Donald Trump was running against. His supporters were sick of all that and were electing him as a giant orange fuck you to the purple-haired condescension set. So we weren't ready for a woman president because we weren't ready to make electing the first woman president an afterthought to the candidate herself. Kamala has consistently dismissed questions about the significance of her being the first woman president of the United States, instead insisting that she would rather focus on why she's the right candidate for the job. And there you go. We're ready for the first woman president because electing the first woman president is not being presented as one of her selling points. The penises are not expected to submit themselves to symbolic castration as a display of their virtue. She knows that she has to earn everyone's vote, and she respects that. As a result, she commands respect that she has earned. And I love that about her. Watching her debate with Trump, it was clear that she knew what it meant to be a strong woman. So many people who use that term conflate being a strong woman with being a haughty or obnoxious woman. But she was not that. Nowhere did I see her demanding supplication for Trump for the mere fact that she was a woman. He would have laughed at that. Instead, she made good on her promise as a prosecuting attorney, she knew his type. She has years of experience getting inside the minds of con men, cheats, abusers, and frauds, and she took him down by the books. When he tried to seem ominous, she was amused. When he tried to puff out his chest, she kicked him in the crowd sizes. She knew exactly how to play him, and eventually he decompensated to such a degree that it was more pathetic than watching the Wicked Witch of the West screaming, "I'm melting." And from that moment on, she was my lioness. And anyone who can't comprehend why needs to remove the plank from their own eye. She has been exactly what we needed while never catering to the toxic strains within her own party. There has been no woke rhetoric from her and no pandering to that nonsense. I think the message was clear from the Dylan Mulvaney Bud Light fiasco, that pandering to woke lunacy is a losing strategy. She's played it right down the middle, and that reinforces why she inspires confidence in me. I, as a straight white male, don't feel like I'm the enemy that's expected to vote for her as the first sign of my surrender. I feel like I am a victim she is rescuing, and for that, I am grateful. But it goes deeper than her ability to reduce Trump to a blibbering mess. There was a time when I would have pontificated wildly about my vision for an Ayn Rand-inspired free market utopia, but I don't have time for that now. It's been almost 20 years since I got enamored with Atlas Shrugged, and I'm dependent on Obamacare for my chronic medication, as well as helping to take care of two elderly parents who rely on Medicare and Social Security. I don't have time for the concepts of a plan that Trump babbles about. What I need is Medicare that covers the cost of in-home care. And I need someone that wants to reduce my taxes rather than throw tax breaks to the cronies that helped him get elected. And I need someone that understands that tariffs only make things worse. If you understood Atlas Shrugged, you would understand that Donald Trump would be a villain in that story, not a hero. That's not to say that Kamala Harris would be Dagny Taggart, but at least she understands how economics actually works. And so I find in Kamala Harris my salvation, my hope, my hero, my guiding light that emerges as a new dawn. A few days ago, following Trump's public playlist dumbassery, I made a playlist of my own. God Bless the USA by Lee Greenwood, Coming to America by Neil Diamond, United by Judas Priest, even courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue, songs that for decades had been held up as right-wing anthems as Republicans bogarted American patriotism for themselves. Those songs felt like they were mine again. The promise of this country once more felt like something that belonged to me rather than the stuck-up bullies like J.D. Vance who treated me with as an unwashed heathen they were embarrassed to be in the same room with. It would be easy to end here on a triumphant note, but there is one more final point that I want to make, one that has thus far not emerged in the course of the natural flow of this writing. I may have bashed the asinine feminism of the mid 2010s pretty hard earlier, but there is one issue I care about more than all others this election cycle: abortion access. Remember what I said about the conservative power players that have always manipulated the common folk to do their bidding? Nowhere has that been more manifest than abortion. Somehow, the people who pride themselves on being belligerent, merciless bullies with no sympathy whatsoever for the weak and the downtrodden expect us to believe that they sincerely care for the needs of the unborn. Bray endlessly with whatever straw man you want about how it's a sweet little innocent baby that just wants to be loved by its mommy, but make no mistake, I refuse to be swayed on this issue, because to do so is to enter into the sort of dystopia that has previously existed only in fiction. I refuse to accept that it is moral to preserve the life of the unborn at the cost of setting up government regulatory agencies to monitor and control pregnancies, the free travel between states and in and out of the countries, and prosecuting women for pregnancy-related crimes. Perhaps you think I'm being too dramatic, so consider the case of Brittany Watts, who miscarried a non-viable fetus in Ohio and was charged with abusing a corpse. Or perhaps you'd like to consider Amari Marsh, the South Carolina woman who was charged with homicide and spent 22 days in jail after her miscarriage. Or maybe you'd like to think about Joseli Baranica, who died after a miscarriage because the doctors had to wait until the fetal heartbeat stopped before they could administer care. Or how about this? I have an ex-girlfriend who, in a previous relationship, almost bled to death from a miscarriage. If the Trump abortion bans had been in place, she would have died. So I will never compromise on abortion. No, I will not accept some restrictions with provisions for rape and incest or life of the mother. All that does is create the very same red tape that is already killing women. I will accept nothing less than full, complete, and unfettered abortion access. A nationwide abortion ban would mean that Christian nationalism has won. As a Christian myself, I see it as my duty to stand against the forces of darkness, and Christian nationalism is currently their most malignant form. I will not live in the world that they demand. To bring it about would be a call for revolution. Do not try to sway me by saying that Donald Trump says he doesn't know what Project 2025 is. He's lying. How many times does the orange lying man have to lie to you before you know that he lies? But even if Trump didn't know about Project 2025, J.D. Vance definitely does. He was Project 2025's pick for VP, and make no mistake, a vote for Trump is a vote for President Vance. Trump will not be able to finish out his second term. He's in obvious cognitive and physical decline, and will either have to step down or be removed under the 25th Amendment. If by some miracle he's able to stay in office, he will only be an incoherent, mumbling puppet for J.D. Vance by 2028. I wish I could conclude on a more positive note, but the dire warning has to be made. For nearly 10 years, we have wondered why so many people look to the man whose entire career has been nothing but an unceasing barrage of lies, con artistry, and chicanery, and chosen to believe him as the sole voice of truth and logic, but we are out of time. If you believe Donald Trump, you have been brainwashed by a cult leader. And if you deny that, stop and consider that the number one response I will get from people who disagree with my words on this matter are the people who say that this is all much ado about nothing. People with Trump derangement syndrome getting up in arms about their silly delusions. No, I am the one living in reality, and I will not be gaslit into thinking otherwise. And when gaslighting is the only defense you have for your position, you are an abuser. I'm going to make myself stop here. I could go on for another 200,000 words if I allowed it. The choice between good and evil is before you, America. Do the right thing.